At the hospital, my stepdad screamed, "Do it now!" and hit me so hard across the face that the nurse at the station dropped her clipboard. But what he wanted was for me to sign paperwork giving him access to my dying mother's bank accounts before she passed. I had been his punching bag since I was 12, always too scared to fight back. But something about him trying to steal from my mom while she was on a ventilator 20 feet away made me finally snap. The slap echoed through the sterile corridor of Sacred Heart Medical Center's ICU wing. My cheek burned where his ring had split the skin, warm blood trickling down toward my jaw. Dennis stood there, 6'3" of controlled rage, his meaty hand still raised like he might strike again. Around us, the fluorescent lights hummed indifferently while monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm from nearby rooms. The nurse who'd dropped her clipboard, a young woman with kind eyes, stood frozen at her station, clearly torn between intervening and self-preservation. She'd seen him grab my arm when we arrived, heard him speaking firmly to me outside Mom's room. Now she was witnessing assault, but Dennis had that effect on people. He commanded rooms. He made people second-guess their own judgment. "You stupid, ungrateful bitch," he hissed, stepping closer so only I could hear the venom in his voice. "After everything I've done for you and your mother, you can't do this one simple thing?" His breath smelled like coffee and the mints he constantly chewed. The same breath that had whispered threats in my ear for 16 years. The same breath that told me I was worthless, that I owed him everything, that I should be grateful he didn't throw me out on the street when I turned 18. His hand lowered slowly, deliberately, and reached for the folder he'd thrust at me moments before. "Sign the power of attorney. Sign it right now, or I swear to God." But something had shifted inside me when his hand connected with my face. Maybe it was the sound of my mother's ventilator wheezing in the background, each mechanical breath a countdown to her final moments. Maybe it was seeing the nurse's horrified expression, a mirror of the horror I'd normalized for over half my life. Or maybe it was the realization that if I signed those papers, Dennis would drain every penny my mother had worked 60-hour weeks to save, money she'd hidden from him in accounts he didn't know existed, money she'd whispered about 3 days ago before the stroke stole her speech. I touched my bleeding cheek and looked at the red on my fingers. Then I did something I'd never done in 16 years of living under Dennis's roof. I smiled. Not a nervous, placating smile, a real smile. The smile of someone who knows something you don't. "No," I said simply. The word hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Dennis's face went through a remarkable transformation. Confusion flickered first, as if he'd misheard. Then disbelief, because in our entire relationship I had never, not once, directly defied him. Then rage, the kind that made the veins in his temples bulge and his jaw clench so hard I could hear his teeth grinding. "What did you just say to me?" His voice was dangerously quiet now, the tone that used to make me wet myself as a child. I said no. I straightened my spine, standing to my full height of 5'6", suddenly feeling 10 feet tall. "I'm not signing anything. Not the power of attorney, not the account access forms, nothing." The nurse had picked up her phone. I noticed from the corner of my eye. "Good. Let there be witnesses. Let there be documentation." For once in my life, let someone see what Dennis Pierce really was beneath the charming contractor facade, beneath the loving husband mask he wore at church socials and neighborhood barbecues. "You'll regret this," Dennis promised, his hand twitching toward me again. But hospital security was already approaching. Drawn by the commotion, the nurse must have called them. Dennis saw them too and smoothly stepped back, his expression shifting into concerned stepfather mode so quickly it would have been impressive if it wasn't terrifying. "Rebecca's just upset about her mother," he told the guards in a worried, understanding voice. "The stress is getting to her. She's not herself." But I was more myself than I'd been in 16 years, because 3 days ago, before the stroke stole Mom's ability to speak, she'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered 6 words that changed everything. "The safe, behind the painting. Destroy him." At the time, I'd thought she was delirious from the mini-strokes that had been plaguing her for weeks. But after Dennis left that night to get some rest at home, I'd searched Mom's hospital room more carefully. Tucked into the lining of her purse, I'd found a small key and a folded piece of paper with a combination written in her shaky handwriting, plus 3 words that made my blood run cold. "He poisoned me." I hadn't understood immediately, not until I'd gone to their house the next morning while Dennis was at the hospital, pretending to be the devoted husband. Not until I'd found the safe behind the painting in their bedroom, exactly where Mom said it would be. Not until I'd opened it and found the contents inside, medical records showing elevated levels of antifreeze in her system from tests she'd secretly gotten done, receipts for life insurance policies I'd never known existed, policies Dennis had taken out on her 2 years ago, tripling them 6 months ago. Copies of emails between Dennis and a woman named Charlene discussing their future together, once the obstacle is removed. And most damning, a bottle of antifreeze, half empty, with Dennis's fingerprints likely all over it, carefully preserved in a sealed bag with a note. In case I don't make it, this is what he's been putting in my coffee every morning for 3 months. My mother, it turned out, had been dying slowly, deliberately, at the hands of the man she'd trusted for 18 years. The man she'd married when I was 10 years old, after my father died in a construction accident. The man who'd seemed like a savior at first, taking in a widow and her daughter, providing stability and security. The man who'd isolated us from friends and family, who'd controlled every aspect of our lives, who'd hit me regularly while my mother worked double shifts at the hospital where she now lay dying. The man who'd been so careful, so patient, waiting until I was old enough to be independent before finally making his move to eliminate the only person who stood between him and Mom's money. But Mom had figured it out. Maybe she'd known for months. And in her final act of love, she'd gathered evidence. She'd protected her daughter one last time. Standing in that hospital corridor, blood still warm on my cheek, I looked at Dennis and let him see it in my eyes. Let him see that I knew. All of it. His face went pale beneath the fluorescent lights. For the first time since I'd met him at 10 years old, I saw genuine fear flicker across his features. Problem here? The security guard asked, positioning himself between Dennis and me. No problem, I said calmly, pulling out my phone. Actually, I need to make a call. Detective Harrison? Yes. This is Rebecca Ashford. We spoke yesterday about my mother's case. I'm at Sacred Heart Hospital. I think you should come right away. My stepfather just assaulted me, and I have evidence you'll want to see. Yes, about my mother, about everything. Dennis turned and ran. Actually ran, shoving past nurses and visitors, his expensive loafers squeaking on the linoleum as he fled toward the stairwell. The security guards pursued him, radios crackling with alerts. The nurse approached me with a first aid kit, her hands gentle as she cleaned the cut on my cheek. How long? She asked quietly. How long has he been hitting you? 16 years, I answered. But it ends today. Through the window of my mother's ICU room, I could see her still form. Machines keeping her body alive while her brain slowly died from the poison her husband had fed her. But she'd won, even dying, even silenced. She'd found a way to protect me and destroy the man who'd destroyed her. And I would make sure her victory was complete. The folder Dennis had wanted me to sign lay on the floor, papers scattered like defeated soldiers. I picked them up carefully, knowing they'd be evidence too. Evidence of his desperation, his greed, his fundamental stupidity in thinking I would just comply like I always had. He'd underestimated both the woman who'd raised me and the daughter she'd created. My phone buzzed. Detective Harrison. On my way. Don't let him leave. Don't touch anything. I almost laughed. Dennis had already left, but he wouldn't get far. I'd given the detective copies of everything yesterday, kept the originals locked in a bank deposit box he didn't know existed. And this morning, before coming to the hospital, I'd done something else too. Something Mom would have appreciated. I'd called Dennis's girlfriend, Charlene, the woman he'd been planning his future with. Using a burner phone, I'd sent her every email, every piece of evidence, every detail of Dennis's other life. The life where he was married, where he'd been slowly murdering his wife, where he'd been systematically abusing his stepdaughter for 16 years. I'd included photos too. Photos I'd been secretly taking for months, documenting every bruise, every mark, every moment of violence. Photos I'd never shown anyone until now. Charlene had seen exactly what kind of man she'd been sleeping with. Her response had been immediate. Screenshots of their text messages where Dennis explicitly discussed killing Mom, where he planned how to access her accounts, where he promised Charlene a life of luxury once the old bitch finally dies. All sent directly to my email, forwarded immediately to Detective Harrison and the district attorney's office. Dennis hadn't just lost. He'd been systematically destroyed by the two women he'd most underestimated, a dying mother and her supposedly broken daughter. Detective Harrison arrived within 15 minutes, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a crime scene technician. I sat in the waiting room, an ice pack pressed to my swelling cheek, while the nurse who'd witnessed the assault gave her statement. Hospital security had already provided footage from the hallway cameras showing Dennis striking me, his face contorted with rage as he demanded I sign the papers. Miss Ashford, Detective Harrison sat down beside me, his weathered face kind but serious. I've reviewed the materials you provided yesterday. The DA is very interested, but I need to ask, are you safe? Do you have somewhere to stay? I'm staying at a hotel, I replied. I moved out of their house 3 days ago after I found the evidence my mother left me. Dennis doesn't know where I am. Good. Keep it that way. He pulled out a small recording device. I need to take your statement about what just happened, but first I want you to know that we've already obtained a warrant for Dennis Pierce's arrest. We were planning to execute it this evening, but given what just occurred, we've moved up the timeline. Officers are heading to his construction company office right now. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. He ran when I called you. Took off toward the stairwell. Airport units have been notified. His photo is being distributed as we speak. He won't get far. Detective Harrison leaned forward slightly. Rebecca, what you've brought us, the medical evidence, the insurance policies, the communications between him and Miss Charlene Winters, This is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of attempted murder I've seen. Your mother was clearly preparing for this possibility. My throat tightened. She knew she was dying. She knew he was killing her, and instead of confronting him or calling the police herself, she built a case. She protected me first. She was smart. If she'd confronted him directly, he might have accelerated the poisoning or made it look like an accident. This way, she ensured there would be justice. He paused. I'm sorry we couldn't have acted sooner. If we'd known she wanted it this way, I interrupted. She told me once, years ago, that if anything ever happened to her, I should make sure I had proof. I didn't understand then. I thought she was just being paranoid because of her work in the ICU, seeing worst-case scenarios every day. But she'd been planning this for months. Maybe longer. The crime scene tech approached with evidence bags containing the papers Dennis had tried to force me to sign. These show clearly that he was attempting to gain access to accounts totaling approximately $1.8 million, she reported. The timing is particularly damning. Seeking power of attorney while the victim is on life support, using physical violence to coerce the daughter. Detective Harrison's jaw tightened. And this is the same man who's been systematically poisoning his wife for 3 months, according to medical records. The same man who took out a $3 million life insurance policy on her 6 months ago. $5 million, I corrected quietly. There's another policy I found yesterday when I went through the safe more carefully. He hid it in a different folder. Mom's note said to look in the red envelope at the bottom. The detective's eyebrows rose. $5 million? And that's just the insurance. There's also her retirement accounts, her savings, the house, everything in her name, because she bought it before they married and kept it separate. Dennis has been living off her income for years while his construction business barely breaks even. He's been bleeding money on gambling debts and paying for Charlene's apartment in the city. I pulled out my phone, showing him screenshots I'd taken of Dennis's banking records Mom had somehow obtained and hidden in the safe. He's desperate. Has been for over a year. That's when the poisoning started, according to Mom's medical timeline. Detective Harrison studied the documents, his expression growing darker. This shows premeditation, planning. This isn't a crime of passion. This is cold-blooded murder for financial gain, and he would have gotten away with it, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. If Mom had just died quietly, everyone would have thought it was natural. She had high blood pressure, diabetes, a family history of stroke, the perfect cover. Dennis would have played the grieving widower, collected his millions, and moved Charlene into the house within 6 months. But your mother was smarter than he gave her credit for. The detective closed his notebook. She documented everything. She got her blood tested privately, showing elevated ethylene glycol levels consistent with antifreeze poisoning. She kept receipts, emails, bank statements. She even preserved the bottle with his fingerprints. I remembered finding that bottle in the safe, sealed in a plastic bag with my mother's handwriting on a label. Coffee poison. Dennis's prints. Do not touch. She'd been meticulous even in her dying. Even as the poison ate away at her kidneys and brain, she'd been building the case that would destroy him. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Charlene. The police just came to my apartment. They took my phone, my computer, everything. I gave them all the messages. All of them. Including the ones where Dennis talked about killing you too after your mother died. I'm so sorry. I had no idea he was serious. I thought it was just talk. I showed the message to Detective Harrison. His expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. He threatened you? Apparently. I scrolled through the screenshots Charlene had sent me earlier. Here, 3 weeks ago. Dennis tells Charlene that once Mom is gone and the insurance money clears, he'll need to deal with the daughter situation, because I might contest the will or cause problems. He suggests making it look like suicide. Says I've been unstable since my father died. The words on the screen were clinical, detached, as if my murder was just another item on Dennis's to-do list, right after pick up dry cleaning and deposit insurance check. This changes things, Detective Harrison said grimly. This isn't just attempted murder of your mother. This is conspiracy to commit 2 murders. The DA is going to want capital charges. Good. The word came out harder than I intended. He deserves everything that's coming to him. A commotion at the nurse's station drew our attention. A woman I didn't recognize was arguing with security, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a shield. I need to see Patricia Moore, she was saying, her voice shrill. I'm her sister. I have a right to see her. I stood up slowly. That's not Mom's sister. Mom was an only child. Detective Harrison's hand went to his radio, but I was already walking toward the woman, my stride steady despite the pain radiating through my face where Dennis had struck me. As I got closer, I recognized her from the photos in the safe. Charlene Winters, Dennis's girlfriend, looking considerably less composed than in the glamorous selfies she'd sent my stepfather. You're Charlene, I said flatly. She spun around, her eyes widening as she took in my bruised face. Oh my God, did Dennis do that to you? About an hour ago, right here in this hallway, because I wouldn't sign papers giving him access to my mother's money. I crossed my arms. What are you doing here? I needed to see her, to see if she's really... Charlene's voice cracked. The police showed me things, messages, plans. He talked about killing both of you like it was nothing, like you were obstacles, not people. And you didn't think to warn us? My voice stayed level, cold. You had evidence of a murder plot and you said nothing? I thought it was fantasy. Just talk, you know? Men say stupid things when they're... She stopped, seeming to realize how that sounded. I didn't know he was actually poisoning her. I swear I didn't know. Detective Harrison had joined us, along with the 2 uniformed officers. Miss Winters, you're not supposed to be here. We specifically told you to remain at your apartment. I needed to see her, Charlene repeated, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. I needed to apologize, to explain that I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did happen, I said quietly. My mother is dying in that room right now because of the man you were sleeping with, the man you were planning a future with, the man who promised you a life of luxury paid for with my mother's life insurance. Charlene flinched as if I'd struck her. I'm so sorry. I truly am. If I'd known, you did know. I pulled out my phone, showing her the screenshots she'd sent me. You knew he was married. You knew he talked about getting rid of his wife. You knew he was desperate for money. But you didn't care, because you thought you'd get a piece of it too. That's not fair. Fair? The word exploded out of me, weeks of controlled rage finally breaking through. You want to talk about fair? My mother worked herself to exhaustion for 18 years. She put up with a man who beat her stepdaughter, who controlled every aspect of her life, who isolated her from everyone she loved. She did all that because she thought she was providing stability for me, keeping a roof over our heads. And all along, that same man was planning to kill her, was poisoning her slowly, painfully, while she worked double shifts at this very hospital trying to save other people's lives. The hallway had gone silent. Nurses, visitors, staff, everyone had stopped to watch the confrontation. Charlene was sobbing now, her mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Your sorry means nothing. I turned away from her, facing Detective Harrison. Charge her. Accessory, conspiracy, whatever applies. She knew and she did nothing. That makes her guilty too. Miss Winters, you need to come with us, one of the officers said, taking her arm gently. We have more questions. As they led her away, I returned to my mother's room. The ventilator continued its rhythmic breathing, keeping her body alive while her brain slowly died from the poison her husband had fed her. I took her hand, careful of the IV lines and monitors. I'm doing what you asked, Mom, I whispered. I'm destroying him. Everything he is, everything he has, everything he hoped to be. It's all burning down. The police have everything. Charlene flipped on him completely. He's going to prison for the rest of his life, and everyone will know what he really is. Her fingers didn't squeeze back. The machines kept beeping, but I imagined I felt something. A warmth, an approval, a final thank you from the woman who'd sacrificed everything to make sure her daughter would be safe. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Local contractor arrested at airport, charged with attempted murder. There was Dennis's photo, handcuffed and humiliated, being perp-walked through the terminal by police officers. His face was no longer confident or controlling. He looked terrified, diminished, exactly what he was. A coward who'd preyed on the women who'd trusted him. The nurse from earlier, the one who'd witnessed the assault, approached quietly. Your mother, she saved my life once, she said softly. 3 years ago, I was in a car accident. She was the first one who noticed I was bleeding internally when everyone else missed it. She fought the doctors until they did the scan that found the hemorrhage. If she hadn't insisted, I would have died. I looked up at her, seeing the tears in her eyes. She was brilliant, the nurse continued, demanding. She didn't accept excuses or laziness. She pushed everyone to be better, to pay attention, to care about the details that save lives. And now I understand why. She knew what it meant to fight for someone, to protect them even when it cost everything. Thank you, I managed to say, for telling me that. And thank you, she replied, for making sure he pays for what he did to her, to you. As evening fell, the hospital grew quieter. Detective Harrison returned with updates. Dennis had been formally charged with attempted murder, assault, battery, fraud, and conspiracy. The DA was preparing to add additional charges as they built the case. Charlene had been arrested and charged with conspiracy and accessory after the fact. The evidence was overwhelming, the case airtight, but I didn't feel victorious yet. Not while my mother lay dying, a victim of the man who'd promised to love and protect her. Not while machines breathed for her and monitors tracked the failing of her poisoned organs. The doctors say it's time. My mother's ICU physician told me gently around midnight. Her brain activity is minimal. The organ damage from the poisoning is too severe. Even if she woke up, she'd be in agony. We can keep her comfortable, but I understood. This was the final choice, the one my mother couldn't make for herself. How long if we remove the ventilator? Minutes, maybe an hour. But she won't suffer. We'll make sure of that. I sat beside her bed, holding her hand, whispering everything I needed her to know, that I loved her, that I was safe, that Dennis would pay for every moment of suffering he'd caused us both, that his life as he knew it was over, that I would live, truly live, the life she'd fought so hard to give me. When the doctor removed the breathing tube, I sang to her, the lullaby she'd sung to me as a child, before Dennis came into our lives, before everything became complicated and painful and controlled. I sang until her breathing slowed, until her heart rate dropped, until the monitors showed the final, flat line. My mother died at 1:37 in the morning, exactly 93 days after Dennis had begun poisoning her coffee. But she died knowing her daughter was safe, her murderer was caught, and justice would be served. I stayed with her body until dawn, making phone calls, handling arrangements, being the strong daughter she'd raised me to be. And in those quiet hours, as the hospital came back to life with the morning shift, I made a promise to her and to myself. Dennis Pierce would lose everything, and I would make sure the entire world knew exactly what he'd done. The funeral took place 6 days later at Riverside Memorial, a modest chapel with terrible acoustics and uncomfortable pews. I'd deliberately chosen the most public, most visible venue possible. If Dennis had succeeded in his plan, he would have had a lavish service with hundreds of mourners, playing the devastated widower while secretly planning which tropical island to visit first with Charlene and the insurance money. Instead, he sat in a county jail cell awaiting trial, and I controlled the narrative of my mother's death. The chapel was packed, not with family. Dennis had systematically isolated Mom from her relatives over the years, but with her colleagues from Sacred Heart Hospital, nurses, doctors, technicians, all the people who'd worked alongside Patricia Moore and witnessed her brilliance, her dedication, her refusal to accept anything less than excellence in patient care. They came in droves, filling every seat and standing along the walls. I stood at the podium, my bruised face still visible despite makeup, and told them the truth, all of it. My mother didn't die from natural causes, I began, my voice steady and clear. She was murdered, slowly, deliberately, by the man she'd trusted for 18 years. Dennis Pierce poisoned her with antifreeze in her coffee every morning for 3 months, causing the kidney failure and strokes that ultimately killed her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several people pulled out phones, recording. Good. I wanted this recorded. I wanted it everywhere. But my mother was brilliant, as all of you know. She figured out what he was doing, and instead of confronting him, because she knew he was dangerous, knew he'd killed before, I paused, letting that bomb drop. Yes, killed before. The police are now investigating the death of Dennis's first wife 20 years ago, who also died of natural causes shortly after he increased her life insurance policy. My mother documented everything. She gathered evidence. She got her blood tested privately. She kept receipts, emails, bank statements. She preserved the bottle of antifreeze with his fingerprints on it, and she hid it all in a safe for me to find. I pulled out the letter my mother had written, found tucked in the bottom of the safe beneath all the evidence. I'd been saving it for this moment. This is what she wrote to me, dated 2 weeks before her first stroke. Rebecca, if you're reading this, it means Dennis has succeeded in killing me. I discovered 3 months ago that he was poisoning me. I could have left, called the police, confronted him, but I know my husband. He would have found a way to hurt you too. So instead, I'm building a case. I'm documenting every moment, every symptom, every piece of evidence. When I'm gone, you'll have everything you need to destroy him. And that's what I want, sweetheart. I want him destroyed. Not just arrested, destroyed. I want his name dragged through the mud. I want everyone to know what kind of monster he really is. I want him to lose everything he schemed and murdered for. Most importantly, I want you to be free. Free of his abuse, his control, his violence. Free to live the life you deserve, the life he's stolen from both of us all these years. I love you more than anything. Be strong, be smart, and make him pay. I folded the letter carefully, my hands surprisingly steady. So that's what I'm doing, making him pay. Dennis Pierce is currently in jail, charged with attempted murder, assault, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The DA is pursuing capital charges. He's also under investigation for the death of his first wife, for domestic violence spanning 16 years, for financial fraud, and for multiple other crimes we're still uncovering. I looked out at the crowd, seeing the mixture of horror, anger, and grief on their faces. My mother saved lives for 30 years at Sacred Heart. She was brilliant, demanding, thorough. She taught me to document everything, to think 3 steps ahead, to never let them see you coming. And in her final act of love, she saved my life by making sure her murderer would face justice. The press had shown up, cameras rolling. I'd made sure they knew about the service. Every major news outlet in the state had been covering Dennis's arrest. Contractor arrested for poisoning wife had been headline news for days. Now they were getting the victim's story, told by the daughter who'd been beaten one final time while trying to protect her dying mother's assets. After the service, I stood in the receiving line as person after person approached to offer condolences and support. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the head of Sacred Heart's ICU, gripped my hands tightly. "Your mother was the best nurse I ever worked with," she said, tears streaming down her face. Brilliant, intuitive, fearless, she saved countless lives, And what that man did to her, she couldn't finish the sentence. He's going to pay, I assured her, for every day he hurt her, for every moment he stole from us. A younger woman approached hesitantly. Miss Ashford, I'm Jennifer Hastings. I was Dennis's first wife's sister. My attention sharpened immediately. I'm so sorry for your loss. Sarah died 23 years ago, Jennifer said quietly. She was only 32. The doctor said it was kidney failure, sudden and unexpected. She'd just increased her life insurance to $500,000 at Dennis's suggestion. He collected the money and married your mother a year later. I've given everything I know to Detective Harrison, I said carefully. They're investigating. I know. They came to interview me 3 days ago. Jennifer's eyes were haunted. I always suspected. Sarah was healthy, active. No history of kidney problems. Then suddenly she's dead, and Dennis is a widower with $500,000. But I had no proof, just suspicions. Your mother, what she did, documenting everything. She's given Sarah justice too. I felt my mother's presence in that moment, her methodical mind working even in death. She'd known. Somehow she'd known or suspected Dennis had killed before, and she'd made sure her evidence would open that investigation too. The funeral home director approached. Miss Ashford, there's someone at the back who'd like to speak with you. She says she's family, but she's not on the list. I turned and saw her immediately, a woman in her late 50s with my mother's eyes. My grandmother, Margaret Sullivan, whom I hadn't seen since I was 11 years old. Dennis had engineered that separation, convincing my mother that her parents were toxic, manipulative, trying to control her life. Standard abuser tactics. Isolate the victim from support systems. Grandma, my voice cracked for the first time that day. She crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled me into her arms. Oh, Rebecca. Baby girl, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We held each other while she cried, her body shaking with sobs. I tried to reach your mother, she whispered. For years I tried, but he blocked every call, returned every letter. I came to the house once and he threatened to call the police if I didn't leave. Said Patricia didn't want to see me, that I was harassing them. That was him, not Mom, I said fiercely. She never stopped loving you. I found letters in the safe, letters she'd written to you over the years but never sent because she knew he'd intercept them. My grandmother pulled back, searching my face. Is that true? Every word. She wrote about missing you, about regretting the distance between you. She blamed Dennis for it. She knew what he'd done, isolating her from everyone who loved her. I took her hand. Come with me. There's something you need to see. I led her to the private room where I'd set up a display of my mother's life. Photos, accomplishments, memories. But I also included the letters, the ones Mom had written but never sent. Letters to her parents, to her college friends, to the people Dennis had systematically removed from her life. My grandmother sank into a chair and read, tears streaming silently down her face. She wanted to come home, she whispered. She wanted to bring you and leave him, but she was afraid he'd hurt you. He was hurting me, I said quietly. He'd been hitting me since I was 12. Mom knew. She tried to protect me as much as she could, tried to shield me from the worst of it, but she was trapped. We both were. Why didn't she? My grandmother stopped, understanding dawning on her face. She worked in social services for 40 years. She knew why victims don't leave. She was planning something, wasn't she? All this evidence she gathered. She was planning to leave once I turned 18 and graduated high school. She'd been saving money in secret accounts, documenting his abuse, building a case for divorce and custody, but he escalated. He knew she was planning something, I think, and he decided to kill her before she could escape. I showed her the timeline, the evidence my mother had compiled. She spent her final months making sure he'd pay for it, making sure I'd be safe. My grandmother's hands shook as she held the letters. She was always so strong. Even as a little girl, she never backed down from a fight. She got that from her father. A sad smile crossed her face. He died 2 years ago. Liver cancer. He never stopped hoping Patricia would come home. I'm sorry, I said softly. Dennis stole that from all of you too. But you've given us justice, she replied, gripping my hand. What you've done, exposing him, making sure everyone knows the truth. That's what Patricia would have wanted. She always believed in truth and accountability. The funeral ended, but the war against Dennis was just beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, I methodically destroyed every aspect of his life with the same careful planning my mother had taught me. First, I went after his business. Sterling Construction had been built on my mother's financial backing and her excellent credit. Dennis had leveraged her money and reputation to secure contracts, to bid on projects, to establish relationships with suppliers and clients. Now, armed with power of attorney over Mom's estate, I called every single one of those loans, demanded immediate repayment of every penny Mom had invested, revoked her guarantees on his business credit lines. Sterling Construction collapsed within 10 days. Projects halted mid-construction. Suppliers demanded payment for outstanding invoices. Employees quit when paychecks bounced. By the end of week 3, the business Dennis had spent 20 years building existed only in bankruptcy filings. But I wasn't done. I hired a forensic accountant to examine every transaction Dennis had made over the past decade. We found evidence of tax fraud, embezzlement from clients, falsified insurance claims. Each discovery went straight to the appropriate authorities. The IRS opened an investigation. The state licensing board suspended his contractor's license pending criminal proceedings. 2 former clients filed lawsuits claiming Dennis had overbilled them by hundreds of thousands of dollars. His personal finances were next. The house he'd shared with my mother, the house Mom had bought before they married, was part of her estate. I initiated eviction proceedings, forcing Dennis's relatives who'd been temporarily staying there to vacate immediately. The house sold within a week to a family who'd read the news coverage and wanted to erase the evil from the property. I donated the proceeds to a domestic violence shelter in my mother's name. Dennis's vehicles, his boat, his motorcycle, all financed through accounts backed by Mom's credit. Repossessed. His country club membership, paid for with Mom's money, canceled. His expensive wardrobe, his electronics, his tools, everything that wasn't seized as evidence or claimed by creditors, I sold and donated to charity. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. Dennis's own mother contacted me 2 weeks after the funeral. "I need to meet with you," Sandra Pierce said over the phone, her voice heavy with shame and sorrow. "There are things you need to know, things about Dennis that might help your case." We met at a coffee shop far from the neighborhood where I'd grown up. Sandra looked older than her 68 years, grief and guilt etched into every line of her face. "I should have stopped him," she said without preamble. "I knew what he was. I knew what he was capable of, and I did nothing." I waited, saying nothing. "Dennis's father, my husband Thomas, he died when Dennis was 16, Sandra continued. "Everyone thought it was a heart attack, sudden, unexpected, but I found things after. Medication bottles that shouldn't have been empty. Insurance papers Thomas had signed without understanding what they were. And Dennis started spending money right after. Money he shouldn't have had. My blood ran cold. You think Dennis killed his father?" "I know he did," Sandra said flatly. "I've known for 32 years, but I couldn't prove it. And I couldn't accept what my own son had become. So I told myself I was imagining things, that it was grief making me paranoid. I let him get away with murder because I was a coward. Why are you telling me this now?" "Because he killed Sarah. He killed your mother. And he would have killed you next." Sandra's hands shook around her coffee cup. "I can't live with any more blood on my conscience. I'm giving a statement to the police about everything I know, everything I've suspected. I'm testifying against my own son because he's a monster. And I helped create him by looking the other way." The testimony of Dennis's mother changed everything. It opened new investigations, provided context for a pattern of behavior spanning decades. Combined with the evidence my mother had gathered and Charlene's testimony about Dennis's plans to kill me too, the prosecution had an overwhelming case. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but I didn't wait for the trial to finish destroying Dennis. While he sat in jail, unable to make bail, I launched a civil lawsuit against him for wrongful death, assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and fraud. I pursued claims against his business insurance, his personal assets, everything he'd ever touched. Most satisfyingly, I started a blog titled "The Man Who Poisoned My Mother." Every week, I posted new revelations about Dennis's crimes. Evidence from police reports, testimonies from his victims, financial records showing his theft and fraud, photos of my bruised face from the hospital assault, copies of my mother's letters and medical records documenting the poisoning. The blog went viral. Within a month, it had been viewed over 2 million times. News outlets picked up the stories. True crime podcasts requested interviews. Domestic violence advocates cited my mother's case as an example of why victims need support and why the system needs reform. Dennis's name became synonymous with evil. His mugshot circulated online with captions like "wife poisoner" and "domestic abuser." His few remaining friends and relatives abandoned him. The court-appointed attorney who'd initially taken his case withdrew, forcing Dennis to rely on an overworked public defender who clearly believed in his client's guilt. And through it all, I made sure my mother was remembered not as a victim, but as a hero. I established the Patricia Moore Foundation for Domestic Violence Awareness, funded by the sale of Dennis's assets and donations from people touched by Mom's story. The foundation provided resources for victims trying to escape abuse, helped women gather evidence safely, and trained medical professionals to recognize signs of poisoning and domestic violence. 4 months after my mother's death, I stood in the county courthouse as Dennis was formally arraigned on 3 counts of first-degree murder: my mother, his first wife Sarah, and his father Thomas. The evidence was overwhelming. The eyewitnesses were credible. His own mother had testified against him. Dennis looked nothing like the powerful, controlling man who'd terrorized me for 16 years. Jail had stripped away the facade. He was gaunt, his expensive haircut grown out into an unkempt mess, his designer clothes replaced with an orange jumpsuit. When they brought him into the courtroom, his eyes found mine immediately. I smiled at him, the same smile I'd given him in the hospital hallway when I first refused to sign his papers. The smile that said, "I won, you lost, and everyone knows it." His expression crumpled. For the first time in my life, I saw Dennis Pierce cry. The trial began on a cold November morning, exactly 8 months after my mother's death. The courthouse was packed with media, advocates, and spectators who'd followed the case obsessively online. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, my grandmother beside me, my hand clasped in hers. Dennis was led in wearing a suit his public defender had somehow scrounged up, but it hung on his diminished frame like a costume. 8 months in jail had transformed him from an imposing figure to a shell of his former self. His hands shook visibly as the bailiff removed his cuffs. District Attorney Michael Torres stood for opening arguments, his presence commanding the courtroom's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state will prove that Dennis Pierce is a serial killer who murdered 3 people over 32 years for financial gain. We will show you a pattern of behavior so calculated, so cold-blooded, that it defies comprehension. This is a man who poisoned his own father at 16 to collect insurance money, who murdered his first wife at 31 for $500,000, and who at 48 slowly tortured his second wife to death with antifreeze while planning to murder her daughter next." Torres paced before the jury, letting his words sink in. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming. We have medical records proving Patricia Moore was systematically poisoned. We have the poison itself, preserved by the victim with the defendant's fingerprints on it. We have emails between Dennis Pierce and his girlfriend discussing the murder plot. We have testimony from that girlfriend detailing conversations about killing both Patricia and her daughter Rebecca. We have financial records showing massive insurance policies taken out months before Patricia fell ill. And we have the defendant's own mother testifying that she suspected for 32 years that her son murdered his father." The defense attorney, a young public defender named Aaron Griffith, who'd drawn the short straw on this case, stood for his opening statement. He looked exhausted before he even began. "The defense will show that this is a case of circumstantial evidence blown out of proportion by grief and a sensationalized media circus," he said without conviction. "Yes, Patricia Moore died tragically. Yes, Dennis Pierce's previous wife also died young. But correlation is not causation. The prosecution wants you to believe my client is a mastermind killer who's evaded justice for decades. The truth is simpler. Sometimes tragedies happen. Sometimes people die of natural causes. And sometimes, in grief, we look for someone to blame. It was weak, and everyone in the courtroom knew it." Griffith sat down quickly, avoiding eye contact with his client. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks with devastating precision. Dr. Rachel Kim from Sacred Heart testified about my mother's symptoms and the private blood tests showing ethylene glycol poisoning. The medical examiner explained in graphic detail how antifreeze destroys the body, causing kidney failure, brain damage, and ultimately death, all while mimicking natural illness. "The beauty of ethylene glycol poisoning from a killer's perspective," Dr. Kim said clinically, "is that it's initially sweet-tasting, easily disguised in coffee or juice. Early symptoms, fatigue, nausea, confusion, look like common illnesses. By the time kidney failure sets in, the victim often can't remember or report the initial exposure. It's nearly the perfect poison. Unless the victim is smart enough to document everything," Torres added, producing the sealed bag containing the antifreeze bottle my mother had preserved. "The fingerprints on this bottle belong exclusively to the defendant. Patricia Moore never touched it, wore gloves to place it in evidence, sealed it herself. She knew what her husband was doing to her, and she made sure there would be proof." Charlene Winters took the stand next, her glamorous appearance gone, replaced by shame and regret. She described her affair with Dennis in excruciating detail, how he'd promised her a life of luxury once the obstacle was removed, how he'd explicitly discussed poisoning my mother, how he'd shown her insurance policies and bank statements to prove the money would come. "He talked about Rebecca too," Charlene testified, not meeting my eyes. "Said she'd be a problem after Patricia died, that she might contest the will or cause legal trouble. He asked me if I knew anyone who could make it look like suicide. Said Rebecca had been unstable since her father died, that no one would question it." "Did you report any of this to authorities?" Torres asked. "No." Charlene's voice dropped to a whisper. "I thought it was just talk, fantasy. Men say crazy things when they're complaining about their wives. I never actually thought he'd—" She broke off, crying. "But you kept seeing him, kept planning your future together. Kept accepting gifts bought with Patricia Moore's money while she was dying from his poison." "Yes," Charlene admitted miserably. "I did, and I'll have to live with that forever." The financial evidence was damning. Forensic accountant Linda Sterling detailed Dennis's desperate financial situation: business debts, gambling losses, expensive lifestyle he couldn't maintain. Then she showed the insurance policies. $500 on Sarah Pierce 23 years ago. $5 million on Patricia Moore taken out over the past 2 years. The pattern is identical, Sterling explained. In both cases, Dennis Pierce increased life insurance policies shortly before the wives fell ill. In both cases, he was the sole beneficiary. In both cases, he stood to gain millions. Objection, Griffith said weakly. Speculation about events from 20 years ago. Overruled, Judge Martinez said firmly. Pattern evidence is admissible. Continue, Ms. Sterling. But the most devastating testimony came from Dennis's own mother. Sandra Pierce walked to the stand with her head high, refusing to look at her son. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in. Mrs. Pierce, Torres began gently, tell the jury about your husband's death. Sandra's voice was steady, but cold. Thomas died on May 15th, 32 years ago. The coroner said it was a heart attack. He was only 47, had no history of heart disease, was active and healthy, but I found things after he died that troubled me. What things? Medication bottles in our bathroom that had been full the week before and were suddenly empty. Digitalis, specifically. Thomas's father's heart medication that Thomas had picked up from the pharmacy for his grandfather. I asked Dennis about it, and he said Grandpa had taken the bottles by mistake. But Grandpa lived 2 hours away and hadn't been to our house in months. What else did you find? Life insurance papers. Thomas had signed a policy for $200, $200 just 2 months before he died. Unusual for us. We'd never had that kind of coverage before. Dennis had brought the papers home and encouraged Thomas to sign them, said it was a good deal through his friend's insurance company. Thomas signed without really reading them. And after your husband's death, Dennis got the insurance money. All of it. Because he was listed as primary beneficiary with me as secondary. At the time, I thought it was a mistake. Thomas would never have made Dennis primary. But Dennis said Dad had done it to avoid inheritance taxes or some legal reason I didn't understand. He used the money to start his construction business. Torres approached the witness stand. Mrs. Pierce, why didn't you report your suspicions to the police? Sandra finally looked at Dennis, her expression one of profound sadness and disgust. Because he was my son. Because I couldn't accept what he'd done. Because I told myself I was being paranoid. That grief was making me see things that weren't there. And because I was a coward. But you're testifying now. Because he killed 2 more people that I know of. Probably more. Because he would have killed Rebecca next. Because I can't live with any more deaths on my conscience. Her voice broke. My son is a monster. I gave birth to him. I raised him. And I failed to stop him from becoming what he is. The least I can do now is tell the truth. Dennis made a sound, a choked sob or protest, but his attorney put a hand on his arm, stopping him from speaking. It didn't matter. The jury had seen his mother condemn him with such finality that there was no coming back from it. Jennifer Hastings, Sarah Pierce's sister, testified next about her suspicions regarding Sarah's death. My sister was healthy, vibrant, planning to leave Dennis, actually. She'd confided in me that the marriage was wrong, that she'd made a mistake. 2 weeks later, she was dead from kidney failure. Dennis collected the insurance money and remarried within a year. Did you report your suspicions? I tried. The police said there was no evidence of foul play, that Sarah's death had been investigated and ruled natural causes. Without proof, there was nothing they could do. Jennifer looked at me. Patricia Moore gave my sister justice by documenting everything so carefully. If she hadn't, Dennis would have gotten away with it again. The evidence mounted relentlessly. Emails between Dennis and his contractor friends discussing how to fake business expenses to hide money from my mother. Text messages to Charlene about the old bitch finally dying soon. Bank records showing he'd paid cash for large purchases he'd hidden from Mom. A motorcycle, a boat, expensive tools, all bought with money he'd embezzled from his own business. When I took the stand, Torres walked me through 16 years of abuse. I described in clinical detail every beating, every threat, every moment of terror. The courtroom was silent except for the sounds of people crying as I recounted my childhood. Did your mother know about the abuse? Yes. She tried to protect me as much as she could, but Dennis was careful. He never hit me where bruises would show. He never did it in front of witnesses, and he threatened to kill Mom if I ever told anyone. I believed him. Now I know I was right to believe him. He'd already killed twice before. Tell the jury about the hospital incident. I described that day in excruciating detail. Dennis breaking in, demanding I sign papers, hitting me when I refused. Natalie watching without helping. He split my cheek open with his ring, dislocated my shoulder. Would have done worse if security hadn't intervened. And all because I wouldn't give him access to my dying mother's money. Money he'd been planning to steal all along. Torres produced photos of my injuries, blown up on screens around the courtroom. Jurors visibly recoiled. And what happened after you refused to sign? Dennis ran. He knew I'd figured it out, that I had the evidence my mother had gathered. He tried to flee to Mexico, but was arrested at the airport. On cross-examination, Griffith tried half-heartedly to suggest I was exaggerating, that I'd misunderstood Dennis's intentions. It went nowhere. So your mother, who was dying from poison, had the presence of mind to gather evidence, preserve a bottle with fingerprints, document symptoms, and hide everything in a safe? Griffith asked skeptically. My mother was brilliant, I said simply. She was a trauma nurse for 30 years. She knew how to handle emergencies. She knew how to document evidence. And she loved me enough to use her dying months to make sure I'd be safe after she was gone. Isn't it possible she was confused? That the kidney failure affected her judgment? The evidence speaks for itself, Mr. Griffith. Everything she documented has been verified by independent medical experts. Every claim she made has been proven true. My mother wasn't confused. She was methodical. The prosecution rested after 3 weeks. The defense case lasted less than 2 days. Griffith called character witnesses who testified that Dennis had seemed like a normal person, a good neighbor, a solid contractor. None of them had known him well. None could refute the evidence of murder. Dennis himself never took the stand. Griffith refused to allow it, knowing the prosecution would destroy him on cross-examination. Closing arguments were brief, but powerful. Torres summarized the case with devastating precision. 3 victims over 32 years, 3 life insurance policies, 3 sudden, suspicious deaths, and 1 defendant who profited from all of them. The evidence is overwhelming. The pattern is clear. Dennis Pierce is a serial killer who murdered for money. The only question is whether you'll hold him accountable. Griffith's closing was defeated before he began. The prosecution has built a circumstantial case based on suspicion and speculation. They want you to connect dots that may not be connected, to see patterns where there might be coincidence. I ask you to consider reasonable doubt, to remember that correlation is not causation, and to recognize that sometimes tragedies are just tragedies. Even Griffith didn't sound like he believed it. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, Dennis's hands were shaking so badly the bailiff had to help him stand. In the matter of the state versus Dennis Pierce, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Patricia Moore, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Pierce? Guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Thomas Pierce? Guilty. Dennis collapsed. Actually collapsed, his legs giving out. The bailiff catching him before he hit the ground. The courtroom erupted in applause and tears. Judge Martinez banged her gavel for order. The defendant will remain in custody pending sentencing, she announced. This court stands in recess. I sat frozen, my grandmother sobbing beside me as they dragged Dennis away. He twisted in the guard's grip, trying to look back at me, and I made sure he saw my face one final time. Not angry, not grieving, not traumatized, triumphant. Sentencing took place 3 weeks later. Judge Martinez had reviewed pre-sentencing reports, victim impact statements, and the prosecution's recommendations. The courtroom was packed again, but this time Dennis sat slumped in his chair, a man already dead inside. The court has reviewed the evidence and testimony in this case, Judge Martinez began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. What we have witnessed is perhaps the most calculated, cold-blooded series of murders this jurisdiction has ever seen. Dennis Pierce is a predator who identified vulnerable people, isolated them from support systems, and systematically murdered them for financial gain over a period spanning 3 decades. She looked directly at Dennis, her expression one of barely contained disgust. You murdered your father at 16 to start your business. You murdered your first wife at 31 for $500,000. And you murdered Patricia Moore after 18 years of marriage, after years of abusing her daughter, after slowly poisoning her while she worked double shifts trying to support your failing business. You showed no remorse, no humanity, no hint of conscience. Dennis stared at his hands, tears streaming silently down his face. The aggravating factors in this case are overwhelming. 3 separate murders across 3 decades, demonstrating a pattern of predatory behavior. Murder of a spouse, twice. Murder for financial gain, all 3 cases. Extreme cruelty in the murder of Patricia Moore, who suffered 3 months of agonizing poisoning, and conspiracy to commit additional murder, as evidenced by your plans to kill Rebecca Ashford after her mother's death. Judge Martinez paused, flipping through documents. The court has received over 300 letters supporting the victim's family. Letters from Patricia Moore's colleagues describing her brilliance and dedication. Letters from domestic violence advocates citing this case as an example of why we need better protections. Letters from abuse survivors thanking Rebecca Ashford for her courage in exposing you. The court has also received exactly 0 letters supporting you, Mr. Pierce. Your own mother testified against you. Your siblings have disowned you. Your former friends have publicly stated they are horrified by your actions. You have no one left, nothing left, and that is appropriate because you deserve nothing. She straightened the papers before her. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Thomas Pierce, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Pierce, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Patricia Moore, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively. 3 life sentences. Dennis would die in prison no matter how long he lived. Additionally, Judge Martinez continued. The court is ordering full restitution to Rebecca Ashford for the financial losses caused by your fraud and embezzlement. The court is also ordering that any future earnings, inheritances, or assets you may come into shall be seized and distributed to your victims' families. You will have nothing, earn nothing, and die with nothing. Mr. Pierce, do you have anything to say before this court? Dennis tried to stand, the bailiff supporting his elbow. His voice when he spoke was broken, barely audible. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I never meant... Rebecca... Please save it. Judge Martinez cut him off sharply. Your apologies mean nothing. They come only after you were caught, only after you were held accountable. True remorse would have meant stopping after your father, or after Sarah, or at any point during the 3 months you watched Patricia suffer. You had countless chances to show mercy, to show humanity. You showed none. She banged her gavel. Court is adjourned. Mr. Pierce, you will be transferred to maximum security state prison to begin serving your sentences immediately. As the guards moved to take Dennis away, he tried once more to look at me, but I'd already turned away, walking toward the exit with my grandmother's arm around my shoulders. He didn't deserve even a glance. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed immediately. I'd prepared a statement, had practiced it with my therapist and the victims' advocates who'd been coaching me through the trial. Justice has been served today, I said, my voice steady and clear. Dennis Pierce will spend the rest of his life in prison, exactly as he deserves. But this case is about more than one killer. It's about the thousands of people, mostly women, who are being abused, controlled, and even murdered by their partners every year. My mother couldn't speak for herself in the end, but she made sure her voice would be heard through evidence, through documentation, through her refusal to let her murderer escape justice. I pulled out a photo of my mother from her hospital badge, taken 2 years before her death. She looked tired but strong, her eyes intelligent and kind. Patricia Moore was a brilliant nurse who saved countless lives. She was a loving mother who protected her daughter even while dying. And she was a fighter who made sure that even in death, she would expose evil and prevent future harm. The Patricia Moore Foundation will continue her work, helping victims of domestic violence escape safely, and documenting abuse so killers like Dennis Pierce can be held accountable. Rebecca, what will you do now? A reporter called out. I'm going to live, I replied simply. The life my mother fought for me to have. The life Dennis tried to steal. I'm going to medical school in the fall. I'm going to become a doctor, like my mother wanted, and I'm going to spend my career helping people the way she did, by being thorough, demanding, and never accepting easy answers when something seems wrong. Do you forgive Dennis Pierce? The question hung in the air, every camera focused on my face, waiting for the sound bite about mercy and healing and moving forward. No, I said flatly. I will never forgive him. He murdered 3 people. He abused me for 16 years. He tortured my mother to death while planning to kill me next. Forgiveness is for people who show genuine remorse, who take accountability, who try to make amends. Dennis showed none of those things. He's sorry he got caught, not sorry for what he did. So no, I don't forgive him. I'm simply glad he'll spend the rest of his miserable life in a cell, knowing that he lost everything while the daughter he terrorized went on to thrive. That clip went viral within hours. Some people criticized me for being cold or unforgiving, but 10 times as many praised me for refusing to perform the expected narrative of healing through mercy. Domestic violence advocates particularly celebrated my honesty. Finally, a victim who refused to make her abuser feel better about his crimes. The next 6 months passed in a blur of media interviews, speaking engagements, and foundation work. The Patricia Moore Foundation grew beyond anything I'd imagined, raising over $2 million in donations. We established safe houses for abuse victims, funded legal aid for women escaping violent partners, and created training programs teaching medical professionals how to recognize and document poisoning. I also started college courses again, studying pre-med at night while managing the foundation during the day. My grandmother moved in with me, filling the apartment with warmth and laughter I hadn't experienced since childhood. We cooked together, talked for hours about my mother, and slowly rebuilt the family Dennis had torn apart. I even started dating, cautiously, carefully, but genuinely. A medical student named James who understood trauma, who respected my boundaries, who never once tried to rush or pressure me. We took things slowly, building trust, creating something healthy from the ashes of my destroyed childhood. But the most satisfying moment came 9 months after sentencing, when I received a letter from a woman named Michelle Torres. She wrote, "Dear Rebecca, I don't know if you remember me, but I was in the courtroom every day of Dennis Pierce's trial. I was there because 10 years ago my husband poisoned me. I survived barely, but I had no proof, no documentation, no evidence. The police didn't believe me. My family thought I was paranoid. I divorced him, but he was never charged with anything. He went on to remarry, and I've spent 10 years terrified he'll kill his new wife like he tried to kill me. Watching your mother's case, Seeing how she documented everything gave me the courage to hire a private investigator. We found evidence, emails, financial records, witnesses who saw him buy the poison. Because of what I learned from your mother's example, my ex-husband was arrested last week and charged with attempted murder. I'm testifying at his preliminary hearing next month. I wanted you to know that your mother's legacy extends beyond your family. She taught us all how to fight back, how to gather evidence, how to be believed. Thank you for sharing her story. Thank you for refusing to let Dennis escape justice. You saved my life by showing me it was possible to prove what had been done to me. I cried reading that letter, showing it to my grandmother through tears. This was what Mom had wanted, not just revenge against Dennis, but a blueprint for other victims to follow. Evidence, documentation, proof, the tools to be believed, to be taken seriously, to achieve justice. I framed Michelle's letter and hung it in the foundation office, the first of what would become a wall of testimonials from survivors who'd used my mother's example to escape and prosecute their abusers. 1 year after sentencing, I visited Dennis in prison, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to see him in his cage one final time. The guards led me to a visiting room with reinforced glass separating us. Dennis shuffled in wearing prison gray, his once imposing frame diminished to almost skeletal proportions. Prison had not been kind to wife killers. He picked up the phone on his side. I picked up mine. Rebecca, his voice cracked immediately. Thank you for coming. I've been hoping, praying, that you'd give me a chance to apologize, to explain. I'm not here for your apology, I interrupted. I'm here to tell you something. In the year since your sentencing, the foundation has helped 372 women escape abusive relationships. 29 of those women had evidence that their partners were poisoning them, just like you poisoned Mom. Because of my mother's example, because of the documentation she left behind, those 29 men have been arrested and charged. 3 have already been convicted. Dennis stared at me, seeming not to understand. Your name has become synonymous with spousal murder, I continued. When prosecutors talk about cases like yours, they say, pulling a Dennis Pierce. When victims gather evidence, they reference the Patricia Moore protocols. When domestic violence advocates train medical professionals, they use our foundation's materials. Your crime has been turned into a teaching tool, a warning, a blueprint for justice. That's not, I never wanted, he struggled to form words. I know what you wanted. You wanted my mother's money. You wanted to kill me and live happily ever after with Charlene. You wanted to get away with murder like you had twice before. I leaned closer to the glass, making sure he could see my eyes clearly. But instead, you became the most hated man in the state. Your face is used in campaigns about domestic violence. Your case is studied in law schools and medical schools. And you'll die in here, alone and despised, knowing that every year for the rest of your miserable life, more killers like you will be caught because of how spectacularly you failed. Dennis began to cry, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Please, please, I'm so sorry. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but maybe someday. There is no someday, I said coldly. There is no redemption arc for you. There is no healing or growth or eventual reconciliation. There is just you in this cell until you die. And when you die, no one will mourn. No one will remember you fondly. Your name will only be remembered as a warning, as an example of evil defeated. I stood up. I'm going to medical school, by the way. Just got my acceptance letter from Johns Hopkins. Full scholarship funded by money from the civil lawsuit against you. Turns out your construction business was worth quite a bit once we sold off all the assets. I'm going to become a doctor. Have a career, maybe a family someday. I'm going to live the full, beautiful life you tried to steal from me, and you're going to rot in here. Rebecca, please. I hung up the phone without another word, walking away without looking back. Behind me, I heard him pounding on the glass, shouting my name. I didn't turn around. He wasn't worth even a backward glance. The guard who escorted me out smiled slightly. That the guy who killed his wife? 3 people, I corrected. My mother, his first wife, and his father. Heard about that case. He's not doing well in here. Wife killers don't usually last long in Gen Pop, but the warden keeps him in protective custody. Probably too cruel to let nature take its course. He paused. For what it's worth. You handled that really well. A lot of victims come in here looking for closure or apology, never find it. You came in for something better. What's that? To remind him exactly how completely he lost. I smiled. Exactly. 5 years later, I stood at a podium in Johns Hopkins Hospital's main auditorium, dressed in my white coat with a newly minted MD behind my name. The graduation ceremony had concluded, and now I was giving the keynote address for the incoming first-year medical students. 5 years ago, I began. I stood in a different courtroom watching my mother's murderer receive 3 consecutive life sentences. Today, I stand here as Dr. Rebecca Ashford, about to begin my residency in emergency medicine. The same field my mother dedicated 30 years of her life to. The audience was silent, knowing my story. It had become impossible not to know it. The case had been featured in documentaries, true crime podcasts, news specials, but I'd used that notoriety strategically, turning it into a platform for change. My mother, Patricia Moore, was murdered by her husband using antifreeze in her coffee over a 3-month period. But before she died, she documented everything. She gathered evidence, preserved samples, wrote detailed notes about her symptoms and suspicions. She did all this while working full-time as a trauma nurse, while her brain was being slowly destroyed by poison, while her kidneys were failing. Why? Because she wanted to make sure her killer faced justice, and because she wanted to protect her daughter, me, from the same fate. I pulled out the now famous photograph of my mother in her nurse's uniform, displaying it on the screen behind me. This is the physician you should aspire to be: thorough, vigilant, unwilling to accept easy answers when something doesn't make sense. My mother saved countless lives during her career by paying attention to details others missed, by questioning diagnoses that didn't fit, by advocating fiercely for her patients even when it made her unpopular. She also saved my life by using those same skills to document her own murder. The Patricia Moore protocols for identifying and documenting poisoning and abuse have now been adopted by hospitals in 47 states. In the 5 years since her death, those protocols have helped identify and prosecute over 200 cases of poisoning and domestic violence. 200 killers who would have gotten away with it, who would have gone on to kill again, are now in prison because my mother showed other victims how to gather evidence properly. A medical student in the front row raised her hand. "Dr. Ashford, how do you deal with the anger, with what was done to your mother and to you?" I smiled. The question expected. I channeled it into purpose. Anger is energy, and energy can be directed. I could have let it consume me, make me bitter and broken. Instead, I used it to fuel my education, to build the foundation, to change laws and protocols. Dennis Pierce took my mother's life, but he didn't get to take mine, and that enrages him more than any prison sentence could. "Do you ever visit him in prison?" another student asked. I visited once, 1 year after sentencing, to make sure he understood how completely he'd failed. He thought he'd break me, control me, maybe eventually kill me like he'd killed my mother. Instead, I destroyed his life so thoroughly that his name is now shorthand for spousal murder. Prosecutors say pulling a Dennis Pierce when they talk about calculated poisoning. His failure is taught in law schools and medical schools. He wanted to be remembered as a successful contractor who pulled off the perfect crime. Instead, he'll be remembered as the fool who got caught because he underestimated the intelligence and determination of the woman he murdered. I advanced the slide, showing statistics from the foundation. The Patricia Moore Foundation has now helped over 2,000 women escape abusive situations. We've funded legal aid for victims, established safe houses, created employment training programs. We've trained over 10,000 medical professionals to recognize signs of poisoning and abuse. And we've successfully lobbied for stronger laws around coercive control and financial abuse in 8 states. Another slide showed my mother's handwritten notes from the safe, her precise documentation of symptoms and suspicions. This is what saved my life and put a killer away. Documentation, evidence, refusal to accept gaslighting and lies. My mother taught me the most important lesson a physician can learn. Trust your observations, document everything, and never let anyone convince you to ignore what you know to be true. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, covering the medical aspects of identifying poisoning, the psychological tactics abusers use, and the legal protections victims need. When I finished, the audience stood in ovation, not for me, but for my mother and the legacy she'd created through her final act of love. After the ceremony, I attended a private dinner with the hospital board and major donors to the foundation. My grandmother accompanied me, elegant in a navy dress, her pride evident. At 82, she'd become the foundation's public face, traveling to conferences and speaking events about her daughter's courage and sacrifice. "Patricia would be so proud," she told me over dinner, squeezing my hand. "Everything you've built, everything you've become, this is exactly what she wanted for you." "I wish she could see it," I replied, the old ache still present even 5 years later. "She can," my grandmother said firmly. "I've never been particularly religious, but I have to believe she knows. She sees you thriving, sees Dennis suffering, sees the hundreds of lives being saved because of what she did. That's the heaven she would have wanted. Knowing her death meant something. Knowing you were safe and strong." My phone buzzed with a news alert. Dennis Pierce assault in prison, condition critical. I opened the article, reading quickly. Dennis had apparently been attacked by another inmate, suffering severe injuries that had him in the prison hospital. I showed the article to my grandmother. She read it without expression. "Karma," she said simply, "or just the natural consequences of being a wife killer in general population. Either way, not our problem." She was right. Dennis's suffering meant nothing to me now. Not joy, Not satisfaction, just complete indifference. He'd become irrelevant, a footnote in my story rather than its defining chapter. The years had brought other changes too. James and I had married 2 years ago in a small ceremony at the foundation's headquarters, my mother's photo prominently displayed among the decorations. He'd proposed in the hospital where she'd died, in the corridor where Dennis had assaulted me, reclaiming that space with love instead of violence. We'd bought a house using money from the civil settlements against Dennis, money he'd stolen from my mother, now funding the life she'd wanted for me. 3 bedrooms, a yard for the children we plan to have someday, a home office where I could work on foundation projects and research papers. The nightmares had mostly stopped. Therapy, time, and justice had done their work. I no longer flinched at raised voices or locked doors. I'd learned to trust again, to love again, to believe that not all men were monsters like Dennis, but I'd also learned to document everything, to trust my instincts, to never ignore red flags. My mother's lessons had been burned into my soul, not with fear, but with wisdom. I taught those same lessons to young doctors, to medical students, to anyone who would listen. 3 months after graduation, I started my emergency medicine residency at Sacred Heart Hospital, the same hospital where my mother had worked, where she'd died, where this entire journey had begun. Walking those corridors where she'd saved lives for 3 decades felt like coming full circle. On my first day, I was assigned to the trauma bay. The charge nurse introducing me paused when she saw my name tag. Ashford. Are you related to Patricia Moore? Her daughter, I confirmed. The nurse's expression transformed into something like reverence. Your mother was a legend here. I was a brand new nurse when I started, completely terrified I'd kill someone through incompetence. Patricia took me under her wing, taught me everything I know. She was demanding as hell, wouldn't accept anything less than perfection. But she made me a better nurse, made all of us better. That sounds like her, I said, smiling. She talked about you, about how smart you were, how proud she was that you were going to medical school. She showed me photos of you at your college graduation. The nurse paused. I was here the night she died. I held her hand when they removed the ventilator, and I testified at her killer's trial about the kind of woman she was. Brilliant, fierce, uncompromising in her standards. She deserved so much better than what happened to her. She got justice, I replied. That's what she wanted. That. And for me to be standing here today, continuing her work. My first trauma case arrived 20 minutes later, a car accident victim with internal bleeding. As I worked alongside the attending physician to save the woman's life, I felt my mother's presence in every decision, every assessment, every moment of clarity under pressure. She'd trained me for this without even realizing it, teaching me to see patterns, to question assumptions, to fight for every life with everything I had. The woman survived. As we transferred her to surgery, the attending pulled me aside. Good work, Dr. Ashford. Your instincts are excellent. I learned from the best, I said, looking around the trauma bay where my mother had worked for so many years. I had an excellent teacher. That evening, I visited my mother's grave for the first time in months. The headstone was simple, elegant. Patricia Ann Moore, 1968-2018. Beloved mother, dedicated healer, fierce protector. The truth always wins. I placed fresh flowers, her favorite peonies, and sat on the grass beside her grave. I did it, Mom, I said aloud, not caring if anyone heard me talking to stone and earth. Medical school. Residency at Sacred Heart. The foundation is thriving. Dennis is rotting in prison, probably dying from that assault. Everyone knows what he did. Everyone knows what you did to stop him. Your legacy isn't that you were murdered. It's that you made sure your murder exposed a killer and saved countless other lives. The evening was quiet, peaceful, no dramatic signs or feelings of presence, just the solid certainty that I'd fulfilled my mother's final wish. She'd given me life twice, once at birth, once by sacrificing herself to gather the evidence that would protect me, and I'd honored that gift by living fully, freely, without fear or limitation. My phone rang. James, calling to ask when I'd be home for dinner. I smiled. The normalcy of the question, a gift I'd never take for granted. On my way, I told him. Just saying goodbye to Mom. Take your time, he said. I love you. Love you too. I stood, brushing grass from my scrubs, taking one last look at the headstone. Thank you, Mom, for everything, for protecting me, for teaching me, for showing me that even in death, the truth can win. I promise I'll make every day count. I promise I'll use what you gave me to help others. And I promise I'll never let anyone make me feel small or afraid again. The sun was setting, painting the cemetery in gold and amber light. I walked back to my car feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because the pain was gone, grief never fully disappears, but because I'd transformed that pain into purpose. That loss into legacy. Dennis Pierce had tried to destroy our family. Instead, he'd created a force for good he could never have imagined. Every life saved by the foundation, every abuser caught because of the protocols my mother established, every victim who found courage in our story, all of it was a monument to his failure and her triumph. 3 years later, I delivered my first baby, a daughter we named Patricia Ann, after her grandmother. As I held her in the hospital room at Sacred Heart, I made her the same promise my mother had made me, that I would protect her fiercely, teach her to be strong, show her that documentation and truth and refusing to be silenced could change the world. Dennis died in prison that same week. The assault he'd suffered 3 years earlier had left him partially paralyzed, and pneumonia finished what the attack started. He was 63 years old, having served exactly 7 years of his triple life sentence. I didn't attend the funeral. Neither did my grandmother, his mother, his siblings, or anyone else from his former life. He was cremated by the state, his ashes disposed of without ceremony. No headstone, no memorial, no one to remember him except as a cautionary tale about evil, greed, and the folly of underestimating women. When I received notification of his death, I was in the middle of a shift at Sacred Heart. I read the email, felt nothing, and returned to my patient. He'd been irrelevant for years. Death just made it official. That evening, I took my daughter to my mother's grave and told her about the grandmother she'd never meet, about the brilliant nurse who'd saved so many lives, about the fierce protector who'd given everything to keep her daughter safe, about the hero whose final act of love had created ripples of justice that would continue long after all of us were gone. Your grandmother's name was Patricia Moore, I told my daughter, even though at 3 months old she couldn't understand. She was murdered by an evil man who thought he was smarter than her. He was wrong. She destroyed him even while dying, and because of her courage, hundreds of other women have been saved. You carry her name, and someday you'll understand what that means. That documentation, evidence, and truth are weapons stronger than any violence. That love means protecting those who can't protect themselves. That even when monsters try to silence you, your voice can echo forever if you're smart enough and brave enough and thorough enough. Looking down at my daughter's peaceful face, then at my mother's grave, I understood the full circle of it all. Dennis had taken my mother's life, but he'd failed to take her power. That power lived on in the foundation, in the protocols, in the laws we'd changed, in the lives we'd saved. And now it lived on in this baby girl who would grow up knowing that her grandmother had been extraordinary, not because of how she died, but because of how she'd turned even her murder into a tool for justice. The truth had won. Justice had been served. And the daughter Dennis had terrorized now stood in the place he'd tried to destroy us, thriving with her own daughter, surrounded by love and purpose, and the unbreakable legacy of a woman who'd refused to die quietly. Dennis Pierce was forgotten, Patricia Moore was eternal, and I, the girl he'd beaten, controlled, and underestimated, had lived to see every promise my mother made fulfilled, every nightmare she'd feared prevented, every hope she'd held for me realized beyond her wildest dreams. That was the ultimate revenge, not his suffering, though that had its place, but my complete and total victory. My thriving, my family, my career, my purpose, my joy. He'd lost everything trying to steal from us. We'd turned his crime into a movement that saved thousands. The truth always wins, always.